They say some places remember the people who love them, and sometimes they wait years for the right person to walk through the door. On a cold October evening, rain drifted across the streets of Ashford Harbor, turning the sidewalks silver beneath the glow of old street lamps. Caleb Mercer guided his aging pickup through the quiet town, one hand resting lightly on the head of Ranger, the 6-year-old German shepherd who had traveled every mile beside him. The truck rattled with every bump in the road, but neither man nor dog seemed to mind. After years of drifting from one temporary job to another, Caleb had learned not to expect much from any destination. Then Ranger suddenly lifted his head, his amber eyes fixed on something beyond the rain-streaked windshield. 3 sharp barks broke the silence. Caleb slowed instantly. Ahead, near a stone bridge crossing the Willow Creek, a small sedan sat at an awkward angle beside the shoulder. An elderly woman stood outside in the storm, struggling with an umbrella that the wind seemed determined to carry away. Caleb pulled over without hesitation. Moments later, the woman was safe and smiling despite the rain. But as Caleb helped her gather the books scattered from the back seat, a distant bell rang somewhere in town. Ranger froze. His ears stood high. The sound came again. A bookstore bell. Soft. Clear. Impossible. Because every shop on Main Street had already closed for the night. The rain softened to a steady whisper as Caleb gathered the last of the fallen books and placed them carefully into the woman's canvas tote. The covers were worn and weathered, their pages carrying the scent of old paper and time. Ranger stood beside them, alert and still, his gaze fixed not on the road, but somewhere deeper inside the town. The woman noticed it too. "Your dog hears things most people do not," she said with a gentle smile. Her voice carried the calm confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime speaking in quiet classrooms. Caleb glanced toward Ranger. "Sometimes I think he does." The woman extended a hand. "Eleanor Whitmore." Caleb shook it. "Caleb Mercer." She looked at the books tucked beneath her arm and laughed softly. "Well, Caleb Mercer, since you rescued both me and half my library tonight, perhaps I owe you a cup of coffee." Normally, he would have declined. Years of moving from place to place had taught him not to grow attached to strangers. But before he could answer, Ranger took several steps forward and stopped. His ears lifted. Again, the bell echoed through the rainy night. Clear, gentle, 3 chimes. Eleanor's expression changed. Not fear. Recognition. "That cannot be," she whispered. Caleb followed her gaze toward Main Street. Through the mist and rain stood a narrow brick building with tall front windows glowing amber against the darkness. Painted in fading gold letters above the door were the words Whitmore Books and Letters. The bookstore seemed almost unreal, as though it belonged to another decade. Warm light spilled onto the wet sidewalk. Flower boxes rested beneath the windows despite the season. A brass bell hung above the entrance, swaying slightly in the wind. Yet the street around it was empty. "You own the bookstore?" Caleb asked. Eleanor nodded slowly. "For 47 years. Ranger began walking toward it without waiting for either of them. Caleb tightened his grip on the leash, but the dog continued with calm determination. When they reached the front door, the bell gave a single chime on its own. Eleanor stopped beneath the awning. Raindrops sparkled in the warm light around her silver hair. For a long moment, she simply stared at the bell. "Arthur always said it had a mind of its own," she murmured. "Arthur, my husband. He built this place with his own hands." Her eyes softened with memory. "He has been gone almost 20 years. Inside, the bookstore felt alive in a way modern buildings rarely did. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Thousands of books lined polished wooden walls. Lamps cast pools of golden light across reading tables. The air smelled of cedar, coffee, and aging pages. Somewhere a clock ticked steadily. The sound blended with the rain tapping gently against the windows. Caleb felt something unfamiliar settle over him. Peace. Ranger moved through the aisles slowly. His nose brushed the edges of shelves. His paws made almost no sound on the old hardwood floor. Then suddenly he stopped. At the back of the store stood a tall bookshelf filled with leather-bound classics. Ranger stared at it without moving. Seconds passed, then a full minute. His ears tilted forward. His body became completely still. Caleb knew that posture. The dog was listening, not to a sound, to something deeper. Eleanor followed his gaze and frowned. "That is strange," she whispered. He is looking at the exact same place Arthur used to stand every evening before closing. The clock ticked. The rain whispered outside. And somewhere behind that wall, hidden beneath years of silence, something seemed to be waiting. The next morning arrived wrapped in a veil of pale fog drifting in from the harbor. Ashford Harbor moved slowly at dawn. Fishing boats rocked gently against wooden docks. Seagulls traced lazy circles above the gray water. The scent of salt, cedar, and fresh coffee floated through the cool air. Caleb woke inside his pickup parked near the marina, but his thoughts remained fixed on the bookstore. More specifically, on Ranger's strange reaction to that shelf. By 8 o'clock, they were walking down Main Street once again. The bookstore's windows glowed warmly despite the cloudy morning. A small brass sign hung beside the door. Open. The bell chimed softly as they entered. Eleanor stood behind the counter arranging a display of children's books. Her smile appeared the moment she saw them. I was hoping you would come back, she said. Caleb shrugged lightly. Figured I could help carry boxes or fix something. Eleanor laughed. In a bookstore this old, there is always something that needs fixing. Hours passed quietly. Caleb repaired a loose handrail near the reading loft. He tightened hinges on an old storage cabinet and replaced several flickering light bulbs. Meanwhile, Ranger wandered freely among the shelves as though he belonged there. Customers drifted in and out throughout the morning. Retired fishermen browsed local history books. A young mother read stories to her daughter in a corner filled with beanbag chairs. Elderly neighbors stopped by simply to talk with Eleanor. Everyone seemed to know her. Everyone seemed to love her. Yet every 20 minutes or so, Ranger returned to the same place. The bookshelf at the rear of the store. He would stand there quietly, staring, listening, waiting. Shortly after noon, Caleb finally walked over. He ran his hand along the spines of the books. Classic literature, poetry, old biographies. Nothing unusual. Still, something felt different here. The air seemed cooler. The scent of cedar stronger. Almost hidden beneath it lingered another smell. Dust, old paper, and something metallic. Very faint. Ranger pressed his nose against the lower corner of the shelf. Then he looked up at Caleb. The dog did not bark. He simply held eye contact. The way he used to when he discovered something important during search missions years ago. Caleb crouched beside him. His fingers traced the wood near the baseboard. For a moment, he thought he felt a slight vibration beneath his fingertips. Not movement exactly. More like a distant hum buried inside the wall. Interesting, is it not? Eleanor's voice startled him. She had approached quietly. Caleb stood. Has this shelf always been here? Eleanor nodded. Since the day we opened. Her eyes drifted toward the books. Arthur designed it himself. For a moment silence settled between them. Then Eleanor spoke again, softer this time. Every evening after closing, he would stand right here for several minutes. Never explained why. Caleb glanced toward Ranger. The dog remained focused on the shelf. Eleanor folded her hands together. After Arthur passed away, I tried standing here myself once. It sounds foolish, but I could have sworn I heard pages turning somewhere behind the wall. A sudden breeze moved through the store. Several loose papers fluttered across a nearby desk. The bell above the front door rang once despite nobody entering. Customers looked up briefly before returning to their books. Eleanor and Caleb exchanged a glance. Neither spoke. Then Ranger stepped backward. His ears rose high. His amber eyes locked onto a narrow section near the center of the shelf. A low whine escaped his throat. Not fear. Recognition. And for the first time, Caleb noticed something hidden among the rows of books. One volume sat slightly farther forward than all the others, as though someone had touched it recently, even though no one had. The afternoon light faded slowly beyond the bookstore windows, turning the harbor sky into layers of silver and pale gold. Outside, a cool wind carried the scent of salt water through the streets. Inside, the warmth of lamps and polished wood created a different world entirely, one untouched by hurry. The mysterious book remained slightly out of place on the shelf. Caleb noticed it every time he glanced toward the back of the store. Ranger never took his attention off it for long. By closing time, the last customer had left. The bell above the door gave its familiar chime as Eleanor turned the lock. Silence settled gently through the building. Somewhere overhead, old beams creaked softly. Rain had returned, tapping against the windows like distant fingertips. Caleb helped straighten several reading tables while Eleanor counted receipts behind the register. Ranger remained near the shelf, watching, waiting. Finally, Caleb walked over and carefully pulled the unusual book from its place. Dust drifted into the warm light. The cover was dark green leather, faded by decades of use. There was no title on the spine, no author name, nothing. "Have you seen this before?" he called. Eleanor adjusted her glasses and approached. The moment she saw the book, her expression changed. Not fear, not surprise, something closer to disbelief. "That cannot be possible," she whispered. Caleb turned the book over in his hands. "What is it?" Eleanor stared at the cover for several long seconds. "I have not seen that book in over 20 years. A chill seemed to pass through the room despite the warmth of the lamps. Caleb opened the cover carefully. The first page was blank except for a single handwritten sentence. The ink had faded slightly with age. "For those who still believe stories can find their way home." Eleanor slowly lowered herself into a nearby chair. Her eyes never left the page. "Arthur wrote that." Caleb looked up. "Your husband?" She nodded. It was the first line of a project he worked on before he died. Her voice softened with memory. A collection of letters and stories from people across town. Caleb turned another page. More handwriting appeared. Names, dates, notes, fragments of conversations. Some entries were more than 50 years old. Others seemed newer. Ranger suddenly stood. His ears lifted sharply. The dog moved closer to the shelf and pressed one paw against the lower panel beneath where the book had been resting. A dull sound echoed through the wood. "Hollow." Caleb immediately heard it too. He crouched beside the shelf and knocked gently. The sound repeated. Hollow. Not solid brick. Not plaster. Empty space. Eleanor covered her mouth with trembling fingers. "No," she whispered. "Arthur told me once that every bookstore should have one secret." The old clock near the register ticked steadily. Rain whispered against the glass. Caleb examined the baseboard carefully. Years of construction work had trained his eyes to notice things others overlooked. There, nearly hidden beneath layers of stain and dust, was a thin seam running vertically through the wood. Almost invisible, almost forgotten. Ranger released a low whine. Then he looked directly at Caleb. The same look he had given countless times before uncovering something important. Caleb reached toward the narrow panel. Before his fingers touched it, a sound drifted from somewhere deep beyond the wall. Not footsteps. Not machinery. The unmistakable rustle of paper. As though thousands of pages had just shifted together in the darkness. The sound lasted only a few seconds before fading back into silence, yet it changed the atmosphere of the entire room. Caleb remained crouched beside the shelf, while Ranger stood motionless at his side. The dog stared at the hidden seam as though he had finally reached the place he had been searching for all along. Outside, rain flowed down the bookstore windows in silver ribbons. Inside, the old clock continued its steady rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. Eleanor slowly rose from her chair and approached the wall. Her fingers brushed the edge of the shelf. "Arthur spent years working back here after closing," she said quietly. "Sometimes until midnight." Her voice carried both wonder and regret. "I always assumed he was organizing inventory." Caleb examined the narrow gap more closely. The craftsmanship was remarkable. Whoever built it had intended for it to remain unnoticed. He pressed gently against one side of the panel. Nothing happened. He tried another section. Still nothing. Ranger suddenly stepped forward and nudged the green leather book lying on a nearby table. The book slid several inches across the polished wood. Caleb looked from the book to the shelf, then back again. A thought formed. He picked up the volume and returned it to its original position among the classics. The moment it slid fully into place, a faint click echoed inside the wall. Eleanor gasped softly. A hidden mechanism released somewhere behind the wood. Slowly, almost reluctantly, a narrow section of shelving shifted inward. Dust drifted through the warm light. Air escaped from the darkness beyond, carrying the scent of aged paper and cedar that had been sealed away for decades. Neither Caleb nor Eleanor spoke. They simply stared. The opening revealed a narrow room hidden behind the bookstore wall. No larger than a small office. Shelves lined every side from floor to ceiling. Hundreds of boxes filled the space. Thousands of envelopes rested in carefully labeled rows. Handwritten journals occupied entire shelves. The room looked untouched by time. Ranger entered first. His nails clicked softly against the hardwood floor as he explored the hidden space. Caleb followed. The beam of a nearby lamp illuminated the nearest shelf. Names appeared everywhere. Residents of Ashford Harbor, fishermen, teachers, shop owners, veterans, families, entire generations preserved in paper and ink. Eleanor reached for one envelope with trembling fingers. The name written across the front stopped her cold. Margaret Sullivan. Tears filled her eyes instantly. My mother. Caleb looked at her. You found a letter from your mother? Eleanor nodded. She died 30 years ago. Carefully, she opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter dated 41 years earlier. A letter never mailed, never delivered. As she read silently, tears rolled down her cheeks. Not tears of grief. Something gentler. Relief. Healing. Across the room, Caleb began opening other boxes. Every one contained letters. Thousands of them. Some were addressed to children, others to spouses, parents, friends. Many carried notes in Arthur's handwriting. Research, interviews, memories collected from people who wanted their stories remembered. Then Caleb noticed something unusual. In the far corner stood a small oak desk covered with neat stacks of paper. A single envelope rested in the center. Unlike the others, it carried no dust, as though someone had placed it there yesterday. On the front, written in familiar handwriting, were 3 simple words. For the next keeper. Ranger stopped beside the desk and sat quietly, his amber eyes fixed on the envelope. Waiting. For several seconds, nobody moved. The hidden room seemed suspended between past and present, as though time itself had been carefully stored alongside every letter and journal. Rain continued tapping softly against the bookstore windows beyond the wall. The old clock ticked somewhere in the distance. Ranger remained seated beside the desk, calm and patient, his gaze never leaving the envelope. Caleb slowly reached for it. The paper felt surprisingly new compared to everything else in the room. The handwriting was steady and deliberate. He opened the envelope carefully and unfolded the letter inside. Eleanor stepped closer. The first line immediately caught both of their attention. If you are reading this, then the room has finally found the person it was waiting for. Caleb glanced at Eleanor before continuing. The letter was signed by Arthur Whitmore. His words flowed across the page with the warmth of someone speaking directly from the heart. Arthur explained that for decades he had collected stories from the people of Ashford Harbor. Not because they were famous, not because they were wealthy, but because every life carried a story worth preserving. Fishermen had shared memories of storms survived at sea. Teachers had written about students who changed their lives. Veterans had described journeys home. Parents had written letters to children they hoped would one day understand them better. Some letters contained gratitude. Others contained apologies that had never been spoken aloud. Arthur believed forgotten stories disappeared only when nobody cared enough to remember them. Caleb turned page after page. The room seemed to grow quieter with every word. Then he reached a section written years later. The handwriting had become slightly less steady. Arthur described his growing concern that the collection might vanish after his death. He worried future generations would become too busy to listen, too busy to remember. Yet he never stopped believing that someone would eventually discover the room. Someone willing to protect it. Someone willing to stay. Eleanor wiped a tear from her cheek. That sounds exactly like him, she whispered. Caleb continued reading. Near the end of the letter, Arthur revealed something neither of them expected. The hidden room was only half of the project. The rest remained unfinished. Somewhere inside the bookstore were dozens of empty journals waiting for future stories. Arthur had intended the collection to continue growing long after he was gone. Not as a museum, as a living archive. A place where ordinary people could leave behind pieces of themselves. The final paragraph was addressed not to a specific person, but to whoever found the room. If you have discovered this place, then perhaps you understand something many people forget. Stories are not saved by buildings. They are saved by people willing to care. Caleb lowered the letter. The words lingered in the silence. Ranger stood and slowly walked toward another shelf near the back of the room. He stopped beside a row of leather journals that appeared newer than the rest. His nose brushed one gently. Caleb stepped closer and pulled it free. Inside were blank pages. Hundreds of them. Waiting. Eleanor smiled through her tears. Arthur never gave up on that dream. For the first time since arriving in Ashford Harbor, Caleb felt something he had not felt in years. Not curiosity. Not purpose alone. Belonging. Yet even as that feeling settled into his chest, another question remained unanswered. Why had Ranger been drawn here before anyone knew the room existed? As if sensing the thought, the dog turned toward a small cabinet tucked beneath the far window. The cabinet door stood slightly open, and from somewhere inside came the faint sound of paper shifting once again. The cabinet stood no more than 3 feet tall, tucked beneath the narrow window where moonlight filtered through the rain-speckled glass. It looked ordinary compared to everything else in the hidden room. A simple oak cabinet with brass handles worn smooth by decades of use. Yet Ranger remained fixed beside it, his tail still, his ears forward. Caleb approached slowly. The faint rustling sound came again. Soft, delicate, almost like a page turning by itself. Eleanor held her breath as Caleb opened the cabinet door completely. Inside sat dozens of neatly stacked journals, each labeled with a year. Some dated back 40 years. Others were much newer. The most recent volume rested alone on the top shelf. Caleb lifted it carefully. Unlike the others, it showed signs of frequent use. The leather cover remained supple. The pages carried little dust. Someone had been reading it, or writing in it. He opened to the first page. Arthur's handwriting appeared immediately. But this was different from the letter. Far more personal, more reflective. The journal chronicled his final years. His hopes, his worries, his observations about the town he loved. Caleb turned pages slowly while Eleanor listened. Arthur wrote about children who visited the bookstore after school. Elderly neighbors who stopped in simply because they felt less lonely among the shelves. Travelers who wandered inside seeking directions and left carrying books they never expected to find. Again and again, one theme appeared throughout the journal. Stories connected people. Stories healed people. Stories reminded them they belonged somewhere. Then Caleb reached an entry written only a few weeks before Arthur passed away. The handwriting grew weaker but remained clear. If Eleanor ever finds this room, tell her I never stopped believing she would keep the light on. Eleanor covered her mouth. Tears shimmered in her eyes. Caleb continued reading. Arthur described his greatest fear. Not death. Not being forgotten. His fear was that one day the bookstore would stand empty, that the stories would be boxed away and lost. Yet beneath those fears lived hope. Arthur believed someone unexpected would eventually arrive. Someone carrying wounds of their own. Someone who understood loss. Someone searching for a place to belong without realizing it. The journal contained no names. Yet as Caleb read, a strange feeling settled over him. It was as though Arthur had somehow known him long before they ever could have met. Ranger suddenly shifted position and nudged another object hidden behind the journals. A small wooden box slid forward. Caleb lifted it out. Unlike everything else, the box was locked. A brass keyhole glinted in the lamplight. Eleanor frowned thoughtfully. I have never seen that before. Caleb examined the surface. Carved into the lid was a simple symbol. An open book beneath a lighthouse. The same symbol that appeared on the bookstore sign outside. Arthur's personal mark. Beneath it, engraved in tiny letters, were 4 words. Open when the time comes. Silence settled over the room. Rain whispered against the glass. Somewhere beyond the hidden wall, the old clock struck 9. Caleb turned the box over in his hands. There was no key, no obvious way to open it. Yet as he looked closer, he noticed something tucked beneath the box. A folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. He unfolded it carefully. Written across the page in Arthur's familiar handwriting was a single sentence. The key has been in plain sight every day. Eleanor stared at the note. Caleb looked around the hidden room. Thousands of stories surrounded them. Thousands of clues. And somewhere among them waited the answer Arthur had hidden for decades. The note remained in Caleb's hand long after he finished reading it. The key has been in plain sight every day. The words echoed through the hidden room while rain drifted softly against the windows beyond the wall. Eleanor lowered herself into a chair beside the desk, her eyes distant with memory. Ranger paced slowly between the shelves, occasionally stopping to sniff a journal or glance toward the doorway. Caleb studied the wooden box once more. Arthur had never hidden things without purpose. Every detail meant something. Every clue pointed somewhere. He carried the box out into the main bookstore and stood in the center aisle. Warm lamplight stretched across the polished floors. Thousands of books surrounded him. The familiar scent of cedar and paper filled the air. Somewhere among all of this, the answer had been visible for years. He began walking through the store, shelf by shelf, table by table. Ranger followed quietly. Eleanor watched from the counter. Nearly 30 minutes passed. Nothing. Then Caleb stopped beneath the bookstore's hanging sign near the front entrance. The carved symbol caught his attention again. The open book beneath the lighthouse. He had seen it everywhere since arriving. On receipts. On bookmarks. On the shop window. Even on the brass bell above the door. The bell. Caleb looked up. Rainwater glistened on the glass outside. The old brass bell hung perfectly still. Yet something about it felt different now. He climbed onto a small step stool and examined the metal more closely. Years of polishing had worn away most of the surface details. But near the base of the bell, partially hidden beneath the mounting bracket, he noticed a tiny engraving. The same lighthouse symbol. His pulse quickened. Carefully, he reached beneath the bell and felt along the metal housing. His fingers touched something cold. Something small. He pulled gently. A slender brass key slid free from a hidden compartment. Eleanor gasped. For a moment nobody spoke. The key felt surprisingly heavy in Caleb's hand. Not because of its size, but because of what it represented. Decades of waiting. Decades of trust. They returned to the hidden room. Ranger was already beside the desk before they arrived. The dog sat quietly as Caleb inserted the key into the wooden box. The lock turned with a soft click. Silence filled the room. Slowly, Caleb lifted the lid. Inside lay a thick, leather-bound document wrapped in protective cloth. Beneath it rested a sealed envelope addressed to Eleanor. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Tears appeared before she reached the second sentence. Arthur's final message was simple. He thanked her for every year they had shared. He thanked her for keeping the bookstore alive. And then he revealed something she never expected. The legal document inside the box was not about money. It was not about property. It established the hidden archive as a permanent community trust. The stories would belong to the town forever. Future generations would be able to contribute their own memories and preserve them safely. Arthur had spent years preparing everything. Yet there was one final page attached to the document. Caleb unfolded it carefully. The room seemed to grow still. At the bottom, written in Arthur's unmistakable handwriting, was a sentence that neither he nor Eleanor could fully understand. When the right keeper arrives, the bookstore will choose him. Ranger looked up immediately, his amber eyes fixed on Caleb. And for reasons he could not explain, a strange feeling settled deep inside his chest, as though the story Arthur began decades ago was quietly preparing for its final chapter. The storm had passed by morning. Sunlight spilled across Ashford Harbor in ribbons of gold, turning the rain-soaked streets into mirrors of light. The harbor breathed quietly beneath a sky washed clean by the night. Fishing boats drifted gently at their moorings. Shopkeepers unlocked doors. Children hurried toward school carrying backpacks and laughter. Life moved forward as it always had. Yet inside the bookstore, something had changed. Word of the hidden archive spread slowly at first. Then quickly, neighbors arrived carrying old photographs. Families brought letters tucked away in drawers for generations. Veterans shared journals they had never shown anyone. Parents contributed stories for children not yet old enough to understand them. The empty journals Arthur had left behind began filling with new memories. Every shelf gained new voices. Every week added another chapter to the town's living history. Caleb found himself staying longer than he ever intended. 1 week became 2. 2 became a month. He repaired broken shelves, organized collections, helped visitors find books they never knew they needed. Sometimes he would look up from a ladder and realize hours had passed without him thinking about where he would sleep next or where he would go afterward. For the first time in years, the future no longer felt like an empty road stretching endlessly ahead. Ranger seemed to understand before anyone else. The dog greeted visitors at the door. Children read stories beside him on the rug near the fireplace. Elderly residents brought him treats and scratched behind his ears while sharing memories from decades past. The bookstore had become home to him long before Caleb admitted it had become home to him as well. Then one crisp November afternoon, a black sedan pulled to the curb outside. A lawyer stepped through the front door, carrying a leather briefcase. Eleanor sat quietly beside the window as the man unfolded several documents. His visit had nothing to do with Arthur's archive. It concerned Eleanor's own estate. Her expression remained calm as he explained everything. Then he handed Caleb a sealed envelope. Eleanor smiled gently. "Go ahead," she said. With uncertain hands, Caleb opened the letter. He recognized Eleanor's handwriting immediately. She wrote about the rainy night they met beside the bridge. She wrote about kindness given freely without expectation. She wrote about Arthur's dream and the way Caleb had protected it. Near the end came the truth that left him speechless. Eleanor had no children, no close relatives, and she had updated her will. Upon her passing, the bookstore would belong to Caleb Mercer and the community trust that protected its stories. Silence filled the room. Caleb looked up, unable to find words. Eleanor simply smiled. The bookstore already chose its keeper, she said softly. Months later, on a winter evening, warm lights still glowed through the bookstore windows. Snow drifted beyond the glass. Inside, visitors browsed shelves filled with stories old and new. Near the hidden room, a wooden sign now hung above the entrance. The House of Stories. Beneath it stood Caleb and Ranger. The old brass bell above the front door chimed as another visitor entered from the cold. For a moment Caleb glanced toward the shelf where everything had begun. The shelf that had hidden decades of memories. The shelf Ranger had somehow known to trust. He smiled and returned to helping a young boy choose his first novel. Outside, snow continued falling across the harbor. Inside, the light remained on. And perhaps that was the greatest inheritance of all. Not a building, not a collection of books, but a place where forgotten stories could finally find their way home.